Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Aarti Holla. I'm Secretary General of ESOA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our showcase session today on whether spectrum is the answer to Africa's connectivity questions. We're going to start with a very small presentation from myself, and then one from Richard Womersley, who's Director of Spectrum Services from LS Telecom. First slide, please. Second slide, please. So, first of all, we need to take a look at Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has, in fact, the widest coverage gap in the world. 300 million people remain outside the reach of mobile broadband coverage. And in 2018, mobile internet penetration was only 24%. So is spectrum really the answer to Africa's connectivity questions? When we consider the different options, we know that FTTP is actually cost prohibitive, and it's logistically impossible because 45% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa live more than 10 kilometers away from a fiber network infrastructure. Is fixed wireless access any better? Yes, it's possible, but not in the millimeter wave bands because there's a lack of terrestrial infrastructure in terms of ICT, roads, and power. Mobile and IMT is again cost prohibitive. Universal access would in fact require 250,000 new 4G base stations and at least 250,000 kilometers of new fiber across the region. What about satellite? Satellite Pan-African coverage is available today. The services are already being offered to schools, to businesses, to governments via direct connectivity, and also enabling community Wi-Fi and even mobile backhaul. Next slide. Meanwhile, however, with the COVID pandemic, the world really looks different. Connecting everybody in the new normal has to take account of the fact that usage patterns have changed. The suburban and rural usage that we have seen in large parts of the world is likely to remain and become more permanent. So bridging the digital divide is now absolutely a priority, and even more so than it was before. Next slide. I wanted to share with you a slide from a presentation from a company called Sandveen. Sandveen is a consultancy, and they issued a global internet phenomena report, which basically did an analysis of all of the different technologies and what the usage was of those technologies during lockdown. Their analysis showed that when satellite was used, the most popular applications that it was being used for were in fact YouTube, WhatsApp, and Netflix. So while this might not be directly applicable for large parts of Africa, it does dispel the myths around satellite, which are perpetuated everywhere. You will often hear that satellite is not good for streaming. It's only good for voice. It's not good for so many applications. But in fact, what this study shows is that when satellite is used, it is as good as any other platform. Next slide. Of course, we're not just talking about the digital divide. Even in Africa, we are seeing a transition from connecting everybody, but also trying to embrace 5G. That means embracing IoT, enabling smart cities, smart agriculture, and a host of other services as well. Satellite absolutely has a role to play in extending the reach of terrestrial 5G networks to places that terrestrial networks can't cover. Without satellite, the effects and benefits of 5G will not be felt beyond urban areas. So before we go to Richard, I just wanted to end with a quote from Vera Songwe, the UN Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of UNECA. She said, in dealing with the health and economic challenges of COVID-19, one point has been made abundantly clear for African countries, that we need broadband faster, cheaper, and expanded to the last mile of our populations. So, Richard, what is your assessment? Is spectrum the answer?
Thank you very much, Aarti, for the invitation to speak and the interesting question. And also, good afternoon, everybody. Dan, if I could have the slides, please. So the question is spectrum the answer? Is spectrum the answer to what? And the topic is Africa's connectivity problems. Dan, if I could have the next slide, please. So when we are trying to provide connectivity, there are three things we have to balance: cost, coverage, and capacity. And if you change any one of those, it affects the other two. How does spectrum then affect the balance between these things? That's what we're going to look at, because the question is, how does spectrum impact connectivity? So next slide, please, Dan. First of all, coverage. And this is important, as we've heard from Artie, especially with the way things are currently, is that coverage is critical. Everybody is now working in a different way, whether it's in Africa or Europe or Asia Pacific region. People are working much more from home than they were, which tend not to be in dense urban city centres. So can we improve coverage with spectrum? Well, we need to answer that question in a number of different ways. First of all, different spectrum has different coverage opportunities. So if we're talking about spectrum below 1 gigahertz, then yes, it provides better coverage than higher frequencies such as 3.5 or even the millimeter wave bands. So there is a balance to be had between the different kinds of spectrum and the coverage they provide. But the critical thing here is that even if new spectrum was given today in the sub 1 gigahertz bands to the mobile operators, it wouldn't improve coverage, because they would have to roll out additional infrastructure in those bands, and that additional infrastructure means additional cost. So we're back to the balance again. It affects coverage, but it also affects cost. And more spectrum in an existing band doesn't really improve coverage. It may improve capacity, and we'll look at that in a second. But without new infrastructure, spectrum in any band does not improve coverage. And if we are to improve coverage, the way we do it is by rolling out new sites and new infrastructure, and that requires new costs. So does spectrum solve the coverage problem at low cost or zero cost? Absolutely no, it doesn't. Next slide, please. What about capacity? If we have more spectrum, can we make more capacity? And the answer is yes, to a point. And of course, only if you use it. Now, in a number of countries during the COVID pandemic, additional spectrum was given in order that they could increase the capacity of their networks. And but at the end of the pandemic, a lot of that spectrum has been taken back again. Only if that spectrum was in a band the operator already had and had the infrastructure for, would it make any difference. If it was in a band they didn't have infrastructure for, they would still need to roll out new cell sites, and there's cost associated with that. And the other issue is spectrum gives you more capacity, but only if you use it. And the chart you can see there shows, and I'll explain it to you, it shows the extent to which spectrum that's already available has actually been licensed and is in the hands of the operators. So the blue and the red bars show the situation in 2014 and the situation in 2019. And if there is a bar that is red only, that doesn't mean that in 2014 that country had not assigned any spectrum. It means that there was no data, or at least I didn't have the data available. So we can see actually that there's been in many countries quite significant progress in licensing additional spectrum since 2014. But let me explain the bars at the top. The yellow bar is the spectrum which has been harmonized. And when we say harmonized, that means that it is a standard off-the-shelf band. So the 900 megahertz band, the 1800 megahertz band, the 2.6 gigahertz band. It's one of those bands. And the reason that it's not just one number is that across Africa, there are a range of different bands which get used. Take, for example, the 850 megahertz band. It's used in some countries, and if it is, it restricts the amount of 800 and 900 megahertz spectrum that you can use. So there is a variation. The orange bar is the amount that's been identified by the ITU prior to WRC 19 for IMT services. So why is that different to harmonized? Well, if you look, for example, the whole frequency range from, I think it's 1.7 gigahertz to 2.2 gigahertz, all of that is identified for IMT. But when we then try and break that down into individual bands, we have to leave guard bands. There are gaps between the bands, so the amount that's harmonized is smaller, but that's the amount that the ITU has identified. The ITU also published a study which showed what it expected the demand for spectrum would be by the mobile operators in the period up to 2020. And that's the red bar at the top. And they had different assumptions. One of them was a high assumption, one was a low assumption, and therefore there's a range of figures. So what can we see? In nearly every country, at the moment, only around 50% of the available spectrum, of the harmonized spectrum, has actually been licensed. That means that operators are constrained in the amount of capacity they can offer because they just don't have the spectrum to offer anymore. If you actually dig down into the details, you find things like the 2.6 gigahertz band is actually licensed in only a very few countries. And there have been a number of notable auction failures where new bands have been offered and haven't been taken up by the operators. So that might suggest there's a cost issue as well. So new spectrum does give more capacity, but it requires new infrastructure, which takes us back to where we were before. So it doesn't solve the cost problem, and you can only get more capacity if you have access to and use the spectrum that's already available. Just one more thing before we moved on. If you were to add in the additional spectrum that was identified for mobile at WRC 19, the yellow bar would now, depending how big the screen on the computer you're looking at this is, be about 6 feet, 2 meters above your head, because it's something like, it's almost 15 times more spectrum. Okay, next slide, please. So the question we've asked is spectrum the answer? And is it the answer to connectivity problems? Well, let's begin in an obvious place. Yes, without spectrum, there would be no wireless broadband of any kind at all. So obviously it's important. But no, coverage and capacity aren't enhanced by new spectrum. They're enhanced by new infrastructure. And new infrastructure implies new cost. So it doesn't solve the problem there. Do new bands provide extra capacity or coverage? Yes, they do. But again, there is a cost issue. And spectrum can actually reduce the cost of increasing capacity, and therefore, but only if it's in a band which you already have the equipment for. So spectrum, I think, is part of the answer. Now, I focus very much in this on the mobile operators and their use of spectrum. But when we start to think about capacity, coverage, and cost, it's not just the mobile operators, but any wireless technology. It's true for anything we can look at, whether it's mobile, whether it's satellite, or even Wi-Fi. It's no good giving new spectrum to Wi-Fi if that spectrum is not available in the equipment, because it makes no difference at all. So we have to remember, spectrum is not just for mobile operators, but it's for all wireless technologies. Does spectrum solve the problem? Some of them, sometimes, but there are costs involved. And not quite the answer maybe that you were looking for, but I'll hand back now to Artie to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was a great presentation. This is going to be an interactive session. We invite participants to please put their comments and their questions in the chat. And together with my colleague, Lyndon Petzer, Senior Advisor to ESOA for Africa, he will be moderating that discussion along with Richard going forward. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Artie, and thank you, Richard. Good afternoon from me, ladies and gentlemen. We have heard that there are 300 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that remain outside of mobile broadband coverage. Mobile internet penetration is around 24%. South Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, I beg your pardon, has the biggest broadband coverage gap in the world. We would need 250,000 new base stations across the region to provide universal access. Now, as Richard has asked the question, is spectrum the answer? And he says that spectrum is part of the answer, because without a spectrum, there would be no wireless broadband of any kind. However, we do need appropriate spectrum. But the mere allocation of spectrum is not going to provide connectivity. Spectrum must be used. And Richard, a question to you from my side is, how much spectrum has been allocated for broadband but has not been assigned? And secondly, how much of the spectrum that has been assigned is not being used for broadband?
Thank you, Lyndon. Interesting couple of questions, and it's something we've looked at as an organisation, as a company. How much of the spectrum that's available hasn't been assigned? Generally speaking, around 50%. I mean, there are specific bands we can point to where almost no one has made any assignments yet. We can look at the 2.6 gigahertz band. Certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, it's very, very underused. 2.3 gigahertz, it's been auctioned in Nigeria, a couple of other places, but again, it's heavily underused. And between those two bands, you've got nearly 300 megahertz of spectrum. We could continue on to the 700 band. That's hardly been licensed. And some of the newer bands, the ones identified at WRC 15, like the 1.4 gigahertz L band, also not licensed. So I think on average, we're looking at about 50% of the spectrum that was identified before WRC 19. If we add in that was identified at WRC 19, I think the amount of spectrum that's available that hasn't been licensed would be well over 90%. You know, we've got another 17,000 megahertz of spectrum. The second one is more difficult, which is how much of the licensed spectrum isn't being used. And we tried to do a survey on this, and it's very difficult because to define not being used is not that straightforward. It's very easy to say it's not being used at all. And from what we can tell, that's probably around 10 to 20% of that that's been given to the operators is just not used at all. But then there's an enormous amount of spectrum that's been assigned to the operators, which they are not using to its full, shall we say. So it might be providing coverage in urban areas. It might be providing coverage in areas where there is sufficient business to make a commercial return, but it's not providing the coverage that maybe has been expected from it. So, it's a two-sided question. There is a certain amount that is just not used at all, and then there is some which is not used, but which is used, but maybe not that effectively.
Great, thanks, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage you to start posting your questions, please, in the chat so that we can have a good discussion going here. Richard, I have two questions at the moment. The first one is, what is the basis for the WRC 23 Agenda Item 1.3, based on what you have just said in your presentation?
Well, first of all, we need to decode what Agenda Item 1.3 is. It's the agenda item looking at extending 3.6 to 3.8 in C-band for IMT services, for mobile services. And what's the basis for it? Well, I think the simple basis is that across the European Union, which of course is part of IT Region 1, together with Africa, it's already been identified by the European Commission as a mobile band. So it kind of makes sense from a European perspective that that band would be identified also at an ITU level. The problem is we have to apply this broad brush, don't we, where what happens in Europe gets carried over to Africa, and what happens in Africa gets carried over to Europe, where the actual conditions may be very, very, very different. So I think that's the background, but whether it's the right thing for everyone is a different question.
Perhaps a follow-up to that, as you say, regulatory conditions in Europe or in other parts of the world might not be appropriate to Africa, given the amount of C-band usage, satellite usage in Africa, would this be appropriate, bearing in mind that my understanding of the agenda item is that this band is purely to be upgraded from a secondary to a primary basis for mobile, but there is no IMT identification.
Does it matter if there's an IMT identification? I mean, if it's got a mobile identification, IMT is just a flavor of mobile, so I don't think that would stop anything. The question about C-band usage in Africa, you know, if you look on a global map of where it rains the heaviest, and let's not forget that it's in those countries where C-band is absolutely critical, because it's in those countries where the higher frequency satellite bands like KU and KA are subject to severe rain fade. If you look at where it rains heavily, of course, there's a swathe of countries right around the equator in particular, and that runs right through the middle of Africa. So, you know, in those countries, it's critical. If, on the other hand, I was to go north to, you know, the North African coast, Tunisia, Libya, or go very far south, Linden, to your own country of South Africa, maybe it's not so critical. And again, it's the problem of this broad brush approach we have, that it's not really one size fits all, but the framework for regulation doesn't actually allow us to be more flexible, not easily.
Another question that's come up is, when we look at the USA, which is a major market for mobile 5G, they have only auctioned 280 megahertz. So why in Africa are people still arguing for more spectrum? And is this really needed?
So again, we need to remind ourselves that 280 megahertz is within C-band. This is where the question's focused. And if we were to look at the extent to which C-band has been assigned and allocated in Africa across the continent for 5G, it's very, very small. I mean, there's very few countries have done that. There is, however, quite a bit of use for fixed wireless access in that band. So do we need more spectrum, or do we reorganize the usage we've got? Or should we be looking elsewhere? It's, you know, if you look again at outside of the African region, at places like Asia Pacific, where C-band is also very important for television reception to domestic properties. You know, there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dishes also used for VSAT and other things. There is a move towards a different band. There's a move towards using the 2.6 gigahertz band for 5G. And in fact, if you look at the ecosystem of handsets, there are nearly as many that have the 2.6 gigahertz band available as a 5G band as there are the C band itself. And given that that 2.6 gigahertz band is not widely assigned in Africa, that to me points to an alternative way forward. That's 190 megahertz of spectrum, good solid coverage compared to C band. So maybe we should be just casting the net a bit wider rather than focusing on one particular band.
Great. We've got a comment here which I think would also require a response, is that there's no easy answer about the merits of more spectrum being identified. But is there another way to address connectivity needs other than opening up spectrum bands, all spectrum bands for 5G? We seem to find that spectrum for 5G is becoming a standard agenda item at WRCs. How do we go about addressing connectivity other than to keep on identifying more spectrum for 5G?
Well, first of all, we have to use what we have, right? And I think, as my presentation showed, there's still some way to go in assigning existing spectrum before we start looking for more. Of course, connecting people isn't just a case of mobile or fixed or fiber or anything else. There are a range of technologies which all have a part to play. And of course, satellite is one of those. And the price point is coming down. The equipment is getting easier to use. It may well be the case that we shouldn't be looking for mobile spectrum at all, but we should actually be looking at ways to enable cheaper connectivity, you know, via, for example, a satellite hub and local Wi-Fi. there are so many options for delivering connectivity, and I think the focus on 5G is just this expectation that it's a technology that will solve everything. We hear about low latency and high reliability and massive Internet of Things. Is that really important when we're still trying to connect people that don't have any connection at all? So I think 5G is seen as this panacea, this wonderful thing that will solve all our connectivity problems, but it actually doesn't solve the basic problem of starting with having some connectivity.
A very valid point. I mean, again, coming back to the African context, if you look at what is appropriate spectrum in the African context, where we have very low population density, you have vast areas, there is very little terrestrial infrastructure in the way of roads and power supply and so on. Does it make sense to use spectrum in, let's stick to the mid bands, the 2.6 and the 3.5 gigahertz band? How much coverage is one actually going to obtain using those bands, or should the focus be on, for argument's sake, the sub 1 gigahertz bands where you do get broader coverage?
I mean, if your plan is to cover those areas with a terrestrial service, then you're absolutely right. We should be looking at the 700, the 800, even, dare I suggest and throw into the mix, the 600 megahertz band, all of which have very good propagation characteristics and will provide additional coverage. But we've still got to get the basic connectivity to that site. If we can't do that because there's no fiber, or it takes an enormous fiber fixed link backhaul, maybe that's not the right solution. And I know that some of the satellite operators who are asking some of these questions have put satellite dishes in. I think the big project was Mexico, connected to local Wi-Fi, which people could use on their smartphones. It doesn't require that it doesn't require the backhaul network. It doesn't require the fixed links or anything else. And of course, it still requires electricity, but there's solar power and wind power. So there are ways and means now, I think, to put these things in remote areas without having to deal with all the other infrastructure issues.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, please, an appeal for further questions. But Richard, we have a very interesting question, which I think is quite complex as well. How do you rate the effectiveness of spectrum use? And do you have any references that the participants can access?
I could give you 20 references to different methods that have been used to calculate spectrum efficiency, the efficiency of spectrum use. The FCC has one, the IEEE has one, the ITU has one. There are the very basic ones, such as bits per second per hertz. But I think at the end of the day, it's actually very difficult to compare and to measure effective spectrum use. There's one thing, however, that's absolutely certain, which is that if spectrum is not being used at all, then it doesn't matter which equation you put that into, it is not being used effectively. So if we have spectrum sitting unused anywhere, that is clearly an ineffective use of spectrum. To go beyond that, it's more complex. If you're just providing coverage to economically viable areas and avoiding covering remote areas, is that still effective use of spectrum? And that's more a policy issue, I think, than a technical or regulatory one. So, yeah, I mean, there are lots of measures of effective spectrum use. And all I would really say is make sure it's being used, or at least the opportunity is there to use it, because if it's not being used, it's definitely not being used effectively.
We are still in the very early stages of the WRC 23 cycle. Studies are being undertaken and will continue for quite some while. In a lot of cases, the technical characteristics are still being determined, but your views on coexistence of services and what should be taken into account during these studies in the various ITU study groups?
I think the ITU does remarkably well in coexistence studies. I mean, these things are not straightforward. Let's focus here on some specifics, and I think we can then take a view. I mean, at the last one, there was a big focus on Earth exploration satellite versus terrestrial services, and we're going to have satellite versus terrestrial, broadcasting versus mobile, all of these things going forward. I think it's far too early to say at the moment what's important. What I can say at Lyndon is this, that we've looked at compatibility between 5G and satellite in C-band to see whether it's feasible to use both at the same time, what kind of protections you need, guard bands and other mechanisms. There are ways and means to make that work, but it fundamentally depends on the extent to which you've deployed C-band satellite reception. If you have a country with 100 dishes, it becomes easy to protect them. If you have 1,000 dishes, it gets more complex. If you have 10,000 or 100,000 dishes, it becomes incredibly difficult. And I think that's the other thing with the compatibility issue, that studies that go on. I've seen published studies that take one device and one other device and do the compatibility between them, and then give a result, and that result is carried forward and used as a means to reach a result, a means to reach an agreement, as opposed to the fact that you actually have a network of these things and a network of these things, and the compatibility between the networks is very different to just between two devices. And that's something I think we have to be very, very careful of.
Coming back to the usage issue and the effectiveness of spectrum use, we know that in the C-band, for example, C-band terminals in most cases do not need to be registered with the regulator. So this then creates a perception that there might not be much usage. I think similarly in some African countries, an experience that I've had, you find that terrestrial assignments are also not registered. So there's a problem with record keeping as to what actual usage is. And is this not perhaps part of the problem as well?
Completely. I mean, if you don't have records, you can't protect. And it's up to those that use the spectrum to make sure that they do register it. But, there is, a terrestrial service, depending on how it's licensed, may or may not be registered. If it's, in many cases, if it's not registered, it's probably operating illegally because there's no license. It's only if there's some kind of class license where it could be using spectrum without having to have a formal license that I would expect a terrestrial service not to be registered. Satellite, of course, if it's receive only, tends never to be registered, and those devices aren't shown. But I was at one of the other conferences in this series in the Asia Pacific region, and somebody from Indonesia stood up and said, we have, across Indonesia, I think it was, we have only 1,000 registered C-band terminals. Now, it so happened I'd been to Indonesia, and I can tell you without question that every single ATM cash point uses a C-band dish for its connectivity, but they're not registered. Now, do you protect them? Because do you really want all the ATMs to fail? And these are the kind of issues that you have if you don't have registered services. It makes it extremely difficult to protect both satellite and terrestrial.
What about long-term spectrum planning for future usage and the return on investment of your deployment of new equipment? How important is that in the whole spectrum debate? If I can just add, we've heard now about temporary spectrum being assigned during this COVID pandemic. Hopefully, operators have been able to deploy existing equipment and not have to buy new equipment in new frequencies bands and so on months and then have to redeploy it. But how does one deal with this whole issue of investment cycles, which could change in 4 to 8 years, given the WRC cycle period?
Well, that was what I was going to pick up on, Lyndon, that the WRC cycle is effectively at least 8 years, because it may be 4 years to get something on an agenda, and then it's another 4 years before a decision gets taken. And investment cycles, if we look at when 4G was introduced and now we're looking at 5G, it's probably within that 8-year cycle. So there are very strong arguments to say we need to look ahead and plan ahead and ensure that we are requesting spectrum far in advance of us actually needing it. Of course, the flip side of that is that you may then find that you've been assigned or allocated spectrum, which your investment cycles change, and you decide actually we don't need it after all. I mean, I think for satellite, where you're putting something in space for 10 to 15 years, you do need some long-term certainty about usage. For terrestrial networks, it will be fascinating to see by the next WRC, which is now just 3 years away, how much of the millimeter wave bands that were identified at the previous one have actually been put in use. Because I think the argument was, we need to do this now so that it's available when we need it. Well, is that the case if 4 years later, when you could also have taken that decision, it's still not in use? I may throw a question back at you, Lyndon, if that's acceptable. Do you think that the ITU should have a use it or lose it clause for new allocations?
Wow. I think that could open up a real can of worms. But yes, I think that there needs to be some sort of a mechanism to say, guys, we've allocated the spectrum, it hasn't been used. Do we really need it? If you look at the issue of high altitude platform stations, HAPS, in the early 2000s, what was it, WRC 99, 2000, around there, HAPS was the flavor of the month. There was a lot of spectrum allocated, and was it 2007? A lot of those allocations started being deleted. HAPS is now, HAPS Mark II is making a comeback, and there's more allocation. So I think the precedent has probably been set in HAPS that there needs to be a review to say, we need to look at it. I think the difficulty is with the ITU and the WRC being contribution driven, is an administration or a group of administrations going to stand up and make that call? But certainly, I think it's something that one should consider.
I mean, we've even seen it happen in a strange way for one of the IMT bands. There was a small band, I think it was 2007, it was identified, 2010 to 2025 megahertz, a small TDD band. And that was made available in Europe for mobile services. It was licensed, never used. It's been taken back and given to wireless cameras. So whilst that's not strictly at an ITU level, it is at a whole continent level. So, like I say, it will be interesting to see when we get to the next WRC whether any of this new millimeter wave spectrum has been put into usage, and to what extent it has.
Richard, I don't see any further questions. I see that we do only have about 2 minutes left. So thank you very much for your presentation and for your answers to these questions. Thanks to Artie for her presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, is spectrum the answer? Well, it's part of the answer, because without spectrum, there is no wireless broadband of any kind, be it terrestrial or satellite. And I believe that in sub-Saharan Africa, this is the only way to go. We cannot deploy fiber in sub-Saharan Africa. It's just not economically or practically feasible. So we need a combination of mobile broadband, satellite, and these services must be able to coexist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lyndon, and thank you for the invitation.